Shabbat Shalom. It always feels a little bit strange to me when we read about Pesach in the Torah before the season of Pesach, or similarly when we read about the Jewish New Year in Torah before the season for Jewish New Year. Nonetheless, that is what happens. So we concentrate on certain themes of these two of the most important holiday seasons in Jewish life. That is Pesach and the theme of liberation, and the high holy days, which are about teshuvah and repentance. These themes are, of course, inextricably interwoven. Liberation is one of the main goals of repentance. We seek to be liberated from our own shortcomings and from the obstacles that we create for ourselves very often, which in turn create distance and possibly estrangement between ourselves and our fellow human beings, and certainly between ourselves and our Creator. It would seem then that one cannot have either meaningful liberation or meaningful redemption without repentance and self-reflection. And if I may, it's kind of like me saying to my kids, you want your iPad back? Sure, I'll give it back to you, but you need to think a bit about what you did in order to lose it in the first place. I need to see that they are able to examine their own behavior, to understand what was problematic about it before I'm going to just give in to their demands for the iPad back. So the goal of the high holy days, as we repeat and discuss every year, is repentance. It's about the process. It's about us engaging with repentance, doing the cheshbon nefesh, personal reflection and accounting. It's that process of us looking at ourselves carefully, seriously, sincerely, and taking stock. Our tradition teaches us that in itself is more than just a little bit worthwhile. It's essential. It's essential to human growth, to moral growth, to spiritual development. And Pesach, on the other hand, it's about the outcome. Let's get the heck out of this place. Let's go now. Free us, relieve us from this torture, from this agony. Who are the subjects here? The Jews, the Hebrews. But who else? Who else is in need of liberation and release? Arguably, Pharaoh. Practically, he needs to be freed of the plagues which are causing devastating results for himself, for his people. And, it's not that a despot cares all that much about the well-being of their people, but the plagues are really beginning to undermine Pharaoh's leadership. And he reaches the point after about the third plague where even his greatest magicians and wizards are not able to counteract the plagues. It's becoming embarrassing for him that his leadership, his omniscience is coming up short. Even more practically, what if the Egyptian people decide that they've had enough and decide to rise up against him? So he needs to get the plagues out of his way. Pharaoh, therefore, also needs to be liberated from them. Certainly, they're causing his life to be inconvenienced, to become quite uncomfortable. And what is standing in the way of Pharaoh and liberation? He's unable to begin the process of repentance. At a more spiritual level, Pharaoh needs to be liberated of himself, of the obstacles that he creates. His cruel and sinful mentality, his need, he really needs to exorcise his demons, which cause him to be this awful oppressor, slave driver, a tyrant, but he can't do so. He cannot be liberated because he cannot look honestly at himself. He cannot examine his own behavior, which includes recognizing that there is a God who is greater than him, who demands moral behavior. Instead, Pharaoh is the author of his own morality, rather than adhering to the moral code which God gives all of us, not just to the Jewish people. Pharaoh and his needs are at the center of the moral universe that he creates. The ultimate narcissist. The inevitable question is Pharaoh really in charge of his own malevolence? After all, don't we read repeatedly in these chapters, this week, last week, next week, that God hardens Pharaoh's heart so that Pharaoh continues to turn up the brutality, which thereby allows God to continue to show even greater and more powerful signs and wonders. Is Pharaoh therefore not some kind of device that God is manipulating and controlling for God's own ultimate benefit? Our great scholar, the Ramban, looks at Exodus 7:3 and asks the same question. Exodus 7:3 reads, I will harden Pharaoh's heart so that I may multiply my signs and marvels in the land of Egypt. To which the Ramban responds, they say in the Midrash Rabbah 5:6, that God revealed to Moses that God would in the future harden Pharaoh's heart, so that judgment would be done on Pharaoh for enslaving the Hebrews with hard labor. So with the evil Pharaoh, God sent warnings to him 5 times, and he did not listen to God's words. God said to him, you stiffened your neck and you made your own heart heavy. Behold, I am going to add impurity to your impurity. But if God was the one who hardened Pharaoh's heart, what then was Pharaoh's transgression? Did he really have a choice in any of this? It turns out that Pharaoh, in his wickedness, had unjustifiably treated the Hebrews so terribly that he was punished with the withdrawal, the removal of a path of repentance. He was punished for his very original, his very early deeds. And so we are taught that the case of Pharaoh's behavior is really not mired in some kind of circular logic as it might at first appear to us. Rather, there is a very clear starting point, which was Pharaoh's initial behavior of how he treated the Hebrews. This was so utterly reprehensible that it would appear that God sees no redeeming way out of this situation for Pharaoh, and therefore God's endgame is to let things spiral totally out of control, to escalate to the point that it would become painfully obvious to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians that God actually is in control, and that Pharaoh really has none. I think we need to learn something from this, aside from the catastrophic danger of thinking that we can get away with living in universes in which we are the authors of our own morality, in which we do not speak a moral language that our neighbor speaks too, but we are each speaking our own moral language. In addition to that, we need to live a whole lot more intentionally. We need to become a whole lot more focused on the end game of living in God's image, of remembering with every move we make and with every breath we take that we live under God's sky. We breathe God's air, we drink God's water. And so our behavior needs to be fitting from the get-go. For us as Jews, living with intention means remembering that we are living in God's universe. And therefore there are certain expectations of us, which is why every action counts, because sometimes a negative cycle becomes just too complicated to break, to get out of. And as we know, every negative cycle starts somewhere. Judaism reminds us that the end does not, cannot justify the means. Rather, the end has to be pre-existent in the means. It's about living as if every action counts. A goal which I believe is not all that far from our reach. Shabbat Shalom.